Hello everyone, welcome to chapter 14 of Give Me Liberty. This chapter is called A New Birth of Freedom, the Civil War. So, oftentimes the Civil War is considered this sort of second Revolutionary War, the second major battle that leads to a different way of being in the country. So obviously the Revolutionary War establishes the country, and then the Civil War eventually solidifies the continuation of this. To start out with, we'll go over some numbers that might be of interest to you and some terminology that might be of interest to you. You've probably seen a lot of things in popular culture, and likely you've talked about the Civil War in history classes throughout middle school and high school, but hopefully we'll touch on some new information for you. Thinking about the term modern warfare it's a complicated term because it's evolving all the time. So at this point, what they're talking about with modern warfare is this improvement in weaponry, and the improvements are that it became more accurate. So for a long time, you'd seen people standing in lines and taking what are called volley shots. So the people standing in line all had to fire at the same time in order to likely strike the targets that they were hoping to strike, because the weapons weren't particularly accurate. With more accuracy, there becomes this increased need for people to get out of the way or to hide, and this marching in a straight line towards each other is starting to become not it's starting to become inconceivable that you would do that. So the numbers of dead rose significantly with the more accurate firing capabilities, which makes sense, right? If you're able to strike your targets more easily, you're going to strike more targets, leading to more people being grievously wounded or killed. The population differences in the South coming into this more modern war, you have about 22 million people living in the North and about 9 million living in the South, 3.5 million enslaved people living in the South. So the population differences are pretty vast here, and more people are living in cities in the North. We talked about the manufacturing boom, where the South was remaining sort of this agricultural state. And with that means there's a lot more open space. Considering the improvements in manufacturing, railroads, and the economy in general, the North was favored to win the war. When they did go to war, they had more capability to create the weapons that they needed to fight the war, and they had the ability to use railroads to connect their soldiers with the goods that they needed while they were out fighting. The South had a particular advantage as well at this point. They were fighting on their home soil as the North tried to invade. So whenever you're defending your own space, you obviously know that terrain much better than whoever's invading, and you're also more emotionally connected to the space that you're defending. So being the invader is a distinct disadvantage. A lot of these things make sense, but if you haven't necessarily delved into it to think about them before, it's a good thing to consider the realities that were set up here and that are often set up with any given war. In 1862, this was the first draft law, and it was it was followed by riots, a number of riots, some particularly large ones in July of 1863. But the excitement about this fight fizzled on both sides eventually, and they needed to conscript people. They needed to require people to fight instead. And some people were able to pay others to take up their draft, and some people ended up having to go fight, even though they didn't necessarily believe strongly one way or the other what either side was fighting for. About 2 million soldiers served in the North for the Union Army, and just shy of 1 million served in the South, the Confederate Army. One thing that people used oftentimes in order to encourage people to join before the draft, and then even following the draft to encourage people that they were involved in something worthwhile, was this romanticization of war. And this has been going on for millennia. This is not a new concept, but it was once again applied here, making it sound as if it was just this grand party and everyone was so brave and gallant to go out and fight for these causes. And oftentimes they weren't mentioning the realities of missing limbs or the increasing accuracy of weaponry, and they weren't, you can imagine why they weren't explaining the realities of war if they wanted people to go fight it. But the romanticization led a lot of young people to to fight for governments and causes that they didn't necessarily fully support. As we mentioned, the technology was increasing during this war, so it's a different war than the one that was fought during the Revolutionary War. The railroads were used for transportation of people and supplies, but they also ended up being targets for particularly that reason. If they were moving soldiers into a particular area, or if they were moving supplies for those soldiers to then be better armed, better fed, and more efficient, the trains themselves became a target to try to stop those things from happening. Wooden ships had been popular beforehand, but now iron ships were being built because that meant a much stronger naval force. It was much harder to poke a hole inside of an iron ship than it was inside of a wooden ship. The telegraph is a key addition here for this particular war. It didn't exist in the prior wars, and people had actually fought battles after the wars had ended, and this allowed for a much quicker communication and the ability to send orders from different places. Observation balloons were also relatively new, and those allowed for a previously unseen viewpoint. So people were able to get up higher and get a better lay of the land and a better understanding of where people may be hiding or where they were storing particular items, such as weapons. And as we mentioned, the increase in the technology of the weapons, there were no more muskets. Modern rifles were much more accurate and much more deadly. And this actually caused people to begin to use different tactics on the battlefield, and the psychology of warfare began to change with these behaviors. So there's a very good book, if you're interested, by Joanna Bork called An Intimate History of Killing, and she talks about the changes in weaponry and how that changes the psychology and actually the physical behavior on the battlefield and where people stand and what people are thinking and why they act in a particular way. And she traces several different wars and talks about all the different aspects that you could imagine that go into this. It's a really, really well-written book. On the marketing side of the war, if you can call it that, there's this propaganda machine on both sides. So both sides were encouraging patriotism and jingoism. And jingoism means extreme nationality. So it's this extremist viewpoint where people are so hyped up and so protective of their own nation in their own nation state that they're willing to do things that they might not necessarily be willing to do otherwise. And they passionately defend these nations, even in the face of evidence of wrongdoing. Part of what helped to pump people up for these wars on both, or for this war on both sides, were souvenirs and songs and pamphlets. Songs in particular are quite moving for many human beings, and that they form an emotional connection to the words that they're singing or hearing. And the North accused the South of treason for having left the Union and for going against the President of the United States. So treason had long been this complete opposition to patriotism and especially jingoism. And by accusing people of treason, you were questioning their honor, which was particularly harmful at this point. Photography began to sink in as a popular medium at this point, and battlefield photojournalism was showing the dead, and this sparked a level of outrage in the public that they hadn't had when they were seeing drawings of dead bodies. So seeing the actual photographs of the actual people who were dead allowed the public to discuss this in a way that they hadn't been discussing it before. It allowed them to see the reality of what was happening on the battlefields rather than just reading about it, or seeing these drawings that were oftentimes tainted and painted as this sort of heroic, romantic vision. And it's hard to romanticize actual dead bodies laying on a battlefield. So the conversation changed a lot here. Both sides were relatively unprepared in the long run for a long war because there were no solid national systems for the military at this point. You had the Union Army and you had the Confederate Army, but obviously they ended up needing to resort to the draft because most people weren't interested in joining up, and neither had a particularly large standing army at this point. And with the Confederate States just becoming their own nation, they certainly didn't have all of their national systems shored up. The South, because of that, started out with no uniforms and sometimes even no shoes. So there was a lot less money on the Confederate side, and a lot less preparation due to the fact that there were very limited federal there was very little federal oversight at this point for the Confederate States. The first major battle, not just Fort Sumter, of the Civil War was the Battle of Bull Run in 1861. About 800 people died, and the North actually retreated from this battle. And this is sort of this turning point in the mentality for a lot of people that this would be a short and sweet war. Not that any war is actually sweet, but that's what a lot of people had been saying it might be. And they had hoped that with the secession movement that they would be able to easily reverse this, and that it wouldn't take years of fighting, it wouldn't take thousands of people being killed, that they could eventually tip it back towards a union between the North and the South and figure out their differences from there. August 1862 is a second battle at Bull Run, and this also went for the South. So it's not as if the North was winning the entire time, even though they were favored to win the war based on economic prosperity and based on the population that they had. That it went back and forth a number of times where it looked as if the South might win, and then it looked as if the North might win, or it looked as if it might just drag on forever. Antietam, you may have heard, was the single bloodiest day in American history. This battle took place in Maryland, and it's actually still the bloodiest single day in American history, with 4,000 dead in a single day and 18,000 wounded. And the North actually repelled the South that day. This remains the single bloodiest day, and that's including 9/11, which had under 4,000. And so this is sort of hard to imagine for most people. And you can still tour the battlefield. They'll tell you the details. They'll try to help you imagine. There are popular films that try to depict this, but I think for most of us it remains sort of the statistical nightmare, really. Imagining that many people dead in one place, and that many people grievously wounded in the same place. Overall, there are approximations of how many people died. Sometimes it's hard to tell. Record keeping wasn't particularly well done at this point, and it wasn't particularly well organized, and things could be lost. So there are estimations, and most of them range between 600,000 and 750,000 dead during the war. So you have over 500,000 for sure, up to about 750,000 people. And this represents about 2.5% of the American population that died in the Civil War. And if you convert that to today's population, it would be about 7 million people. So we think about this number, 600,000 to 750,000, as obviously a huge number, but based on the population at the time, it was so much bigger, because this would be the equivalent of losing 7 million people over the period of 4 years in a war against ourselves, if it was to happen today. About 1 in 5 was the average death rate for all Civil War soldiers, so North and South. So you had about a 20% chance of being killed if you joined the war. There was a 3-to-1 ratio of Confederate deaths to Union deaths. So that meant for every 1 Union soldier was killed, 3 Confederate soldiers would also be killed. And there were about 3,000 horses killed at the Battle of Gettysburg alone. So people were still riding horses into battle at this point, obviously, because it's before cars, it's before tanks. So you have horses in many of the battlefield photographs, like you see at the top right also. You can see some horses in the distance, but they have many photographs of dead horses and dead oxen laying in the field as well, who were either carrying soldiers or supplies. And the number dead in the Civil War of Americans equals the number of dead in all other American wars, from the Revolutionary War to the Iraq War. So it seems one point is worth pointing out here is that this was Americans against Americans. So all did count as American during this war. But it's still noteworthy to mention that the American dead in this particular war outweighs all of the other American wars from the beginning of the United States to today. Combat was certainly a reason that people were injured and killed, which seems obvious to say, but diseases actually killed more people than combat. So people were getting diseases from mosquitoes, and they were getting diseases from each other and not able to seek any treatment way out in the battlefields, or so far away from home. Many people died from those diseases. And if they were captured and put into prison, or if they were put into prison camps, or many of the camps that they themselves set up as soldiers, these were breeding grounds for disease. People would have standing water. There was no good sanitation measures that they were taking. So people were often contracting diseases that they weren't contracting at home because there were appropriate ways of dealing with waste at home. This is a chart representing the number of dead and non-combat deaths, combat deaths, non-combat deaths, and wounded or missing in action. And you can see the Civil War, the blue and the red part are the deaths. So there's combat deaths and non-combat deaths put within that, and that's higher than any of the other ones. World War II had actually more combat deaths than the Civil War, but less non-combat deaths. So these are a lot of tricky statistics. You could figure out the best way to phrase it that you'd like to. But you can see, well, it's obviously staggering the number of people who were wounded, missing in action, or killed or died from disease during all of these wars. You can see these two in particular, the Civil War and World War II, have cemented a place in the American collective memory that many of the others haven't. And part of that is certainly due to the number of casualties. And casualties encompasses sometimes wounded and dead. And sometimes people will refer to casualties simply as dead. So make sure you figure out what the statistics are representing when you're looking at them. Emancipation was one of the central issues during the war. So there was this claim that states' rights was an issue, and the states' rights often boiled down to being able to establish slavery or not. And Foner is quoted as saying, "War, it has been said, is the midwife of revolution." So if a war is taking place, that frees up a space for people to make more radical decisions and more radical solutions to problems. So if emancipation was on the table, warfare would allow people to make different decisions and make more drastic decisions than they may have before the war started for fear of starting a war. And the Northern forces originally were forced to return slaves to the South, eventually returning them, and eventually they stopped returning them, and established contraband camps, which had schools and living quarters, and they provided them with food, so that they wouldn't have to keep returning them to the Confederate States. The main crux of this is that they needed to be rid of slavery in order to undermine the South's economy and their ability to fight effectively. So holding your own home ground and having this passionate defense of your perceived freedoms is not going to get you everywhere, and you'll still need financial backing in order to make it a successful fight for you. So by taking away those who created the wealth, the enslaved people, the North felt that they could begin to undermine the economy within the South. By March of 1862, the North was prohibited from returning slaves. So it wasn't just up to particular people, but they were actually prohibited from returning them. So that it was no longer legal to force somebody to go back to the Confederate States. Washington, D.C. banned slavery, finally, not just the slave trade, as we talked about before, and territories associated with the North also banned slavery. And Lincoln was still encouraging this concept of colonization at this point. So he was still hoping that freed slaves would leave the United States. He didn't think that they would be able to blend appropriately into the society and that it would forever be an unhealed wound. And so he still encouraged people to leave the country once they were freed. The Emancipation Proclamation is one of the more famous pieces that you're probably familiar with about the Civil War. And this was put out January 1st, 1863. It declared enslaved people free. This was about 4 million men, women, and children who were freed in the law according to the United States, but because many still lived behind Southern lines in the Confederate States, most of them did not see real freedom until the end of the war. There's a short documentary that I'll post on the assignments page for you to watch about the Emancipation Proclamation. And part of what was different about this was that there would be no payment to the owners of freed slaves as there had been in the past. Britain had paid previously when enslaved people had abandoned the United States for freedom. And there was also no talk of colonization, even though Lincoln had been talking about it over and over again. In the actual proclamation, there's no talk of people needing to leave once they were freed. This is seen as sort of a turning point in the focus of the war. So it's no longer on the table that this practice would continue should the South come back, and it's no longer up for debate if it would be on the local level for people to decide. This was going to be illegal in the United States, and the North still wanted the South to rejoin the United States. So what this meant was that there would be a new system for everything in the South following this change. So if they were reintegrated back into the United States, they would need to reform their society because it was a slave society. It depended on enslavement, both economically and socially. So everything would need to be rebuilt and remodeled. There were some African American troops who fought in the Civil War. About 180,000 served in the Army, and about 24,000 served in the Navy. The 54th Massachusetts Volunteers, this is probably the most famous group of African American soldiers during the Civil War, if not the most famous group of soldiers in the Civil War period. They were an all-black troop led by a white commander, and about half of them died in a South Carolina battle, but what this did was prove their bravery and prove their commitment as Black soldiers, as African American soldiers fighting for the United States. So fighting for this country that they wanted to participate in and be full citizens following the war. There was a popular film made about this called Glory in 1989. Many of you may have seen it, but if you haven't, it's actually not a terrible watch. And there's also a short documentary about the Massachusetts 54th on the assignments page for you to watch. About 1/3 of the African American troops who did fight died from battle, disease, or poor wound care. So this is in contrast with, this is 9-1 when compared with white troop deaths. So 9 African American troops would die compared with 1 white soldier. Contributions from the African American troops were largely overlooked in favor of reunification following the war. There's a book called Race and Reunion by David Blight. You might be interested to read that if you're curious about how that worked. But essentially, the contributions of African Americans throughout the Civil War and following during Reconstruction were set aside in order to bury the hatchet between white Northerners and Southern whites as well. Not Southern Northerners, that's not a thing. And the Navy had been the most open military branch prior to the Civil War. So prior to 1863, the Navy had allowed equality in most situations, and sailor positions for Black troops had actually existed before the war. The Army demanded that African American soldiers do labor, receive lower pay, remain segregated, and be barred from promotions. So they were allowed to fight and be a body fighting, but they weren't necessarily allowed to move up. And they didn't get paid the same amount for doing the same work. In 1864, there's the infamous Fort Pillow Massacre, where 200 of 262 African American soldiers died under Southern attack. So, depending on your race as a soldier, you'd have a wildly different experience during the Civil War. This changing role of African Americans after freedom was promised within all the states was something that took up a lot of mind space for a lot of people. So liberty meant different things in the North and the South. Individual freedom versus mastership. So individual freedom was this concept that the North was more interested in promoting, was that each person was responsible for themselves, where the South was focused on this idea that their ability to hold enslaved people under their own mastership was being challenged, and their liberty was being challenged that way. So people had different ideas still about what liberty meant, which is not a surprise, and it's why your textbook is called Give Me Liberty, because it's focused on this ever-evolving concept of what liberty means and meant. There was a lot of religious and secular language about freedom used to promote emancipation and mastership. So on both sides of the coin here, you had people suggesting that God was on their side, or you had this emotional appeal to humanity, or you had logistical appeals, so economic appeals to the burden of slavery and that sort of thing. So you had people arguing from all different viewpoints, but using some similar language to support their claims. Lincoln noted that the United States was supposed to be based on universal ideas about political democracy and human liberty. And if it was based on universal ideas of that, it shouldn't necessarily be limited to a certain sector of people. The problem that come up against at this point is this nation versus union. So there were fears that the country would remain divided following the war, and that this freedom for African Americans would be this huge sticking point between the North and the South. So even if they were put back together as a nation and became a whole United States again, it didn't mean that they'd necessarily be a union. So it didn't mean that they'd be back together and working under the same thought process. I've included a video for you of the Gettysburg Address so that you can listen to that, and you can obviously easily read it most places as well. And your Voices of Freedom book has it in there as well. It's number 90 in the Voices of Freedom book, and you may be surprised that it's quite short. So it has this enduring ability to capture our attention, but it's quite short, and that's something to think about. It's less than 300 words, so it's longer than a tweet, and likely will last longer than any of those. It's still not long when we think about important political speeches. Religion was holding up both sides of this war. So in church, people were focused on the war as well, and focusing on the Word of God and what it meant and whose side God would be on if he was asked. And many people decided that it was God's work to end slavery and free people. And many other people decided that it was God's work to fight for the continuation of slavery, and that these things were present within the Bible. You read the defense of slavery from a biblical point of view before. And there were people on both sides who believed that they were right and believed that God would support them. Lincoln was unaffiliated with any religious institution, which was quite odd and remains odd even today. And this didn't mean that he didn't use that sort of language or he didn't appeal to that level of interest for people, because he did acknowledge that it was quite a powerful tool for people, and that he'd be able to perhaps convince people to think in a particular way if he was able to understand and explain from that point of view. Spiritualism also started to be popular at this point because contact with the dead became extremely desirable, with so many men and boys dying all over the country. And people were willing to reach into unknown territory to try to make contact with their loved ones who they likely never received their bodies back for most people, because the economics of the whole thing were particularly stark for most people. In the North, things could be passed through Congress that couldn't have been with the South's oversized influence. So things were moving along at a political level, which meant economic expansion. The Homestead Act of 1863 promised 160 acres of public land in the West to encourage people to move and populate those areas. So they were trying to move the population out, spread it out so that the war, if it were to move towards the West, would be protected. And there were internal improvements that were a major focus because transportation was going to be key to winning the war. So building the railroad or building roads that were more easily navigable for people, or creating the waterways that would be faster and more direct for people. You see, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was actually finished. And this is partly due to the Civil War and this need for moving people and goods around at a much faster pace. One business that boomed at this point was the care of dead bodies. As we mentioned, most people couldn't get their loved ones shipped back to them, but people who had money and could pay for it did. And this, if you think about it, it's a thing you may not have always thought about. When there's this level of change, when there's this level of death present, funeral homes, graveyards, headstones, all of those things would come into sharper focus and greater demand. A new process at the time also was embalming. People started to be embalmed so that they had time to send the bodies back to the home where they were to be buried. There's a book called This Republic of Suffering by Drew Gilpin Faust, and she wrote a thematic study of death in the Civil War. So she uses death to look at all these different aspects of society, and one of them was this sort of business boom, with all of these different aspects of caring for dead bodies popping up as an economic boom. Native Americans were and remain present in the United States, and the U.S. forces were taken away from the western border where they had been protecting and breaking the treaties that banned Americans from pushing into Indian territory. So if the forces were taken away from the western border, it meant that there were less people there to clash with Native Americans along those sites. It didn't mean that there weren't any clashes, obviously. Infamously, the Sioux killed hundreds of white people in Minnesota, and about 300 of them, the Sioux, were sentenced and 38 were executed in the largest public execution in U.S. history. So you can see there's a drawing of it at the bottom here. And many people would reference this as an extreme response to what had happened, and they were trying to make a stand that this would not be an acceptable way for things to continue along this borderland. In 1864, we had the Sand Creek Massacre, in which 400 men, women, and children were killed by whites. And these massacres happened over and over and over again. This is something that you would continue hearing about for decades and decades. And there were still movements for Native Americans moving further west and being sent into reservations that were further and further out. The Navajo were famously pushed further into reservations, and they called it the Long Walk. And this was sort of like the Trail of Tears, in that they were forced to walk long distances. People died along the way, and it wasn't an agreed upon movement for them. The Confederate States treated Native Americans surprisingly well. For example, the Cherokee owned slaves and sided with the South because they wanted to see continuation of slavery as well. And the Cherokee were able to maintain some sense of self-government with the southern states because they were going to fight alongside them. So the South didn't necessarily want to take away all of their rights or treat them too poorly at this point if they were also going to help them fight. And another book that I could suggest to you is reading Empire of the Summer Moon. And this is about the Comanche tribe and their fight to remain on their land. Women had a unique place within the Union as well. During the war, women were able to work in the factories as nurses and as clerks in governmental offices, and some of these positions remained open to them after the war as well. So having women at home who were not going off to fight in the war helped them to cement their place within the workforce. They also sometimes snuck into the forces. We've talked about this before, and it continued to happen in every war where women would dress up as men and join up with the fighting soldiers to fight themselves. Much of what women did for the war effort was gather medical supplies and gather money for the soldiers. So they created these grassroots organizations to support the troops, and some of them actually established organizations that were against war in general as well. What they achieved was some sense of independence and a place in the public sphere that wasn't available to them in peacetime or prior to the war. And then with that, they wanted to continue that following the war, and that created more groups pushing for women's rights that had already been started before. The Confederate nation, the Confederate States, were led by Jefferson Davis, and he's noted as being a less than competent leader, and certainly a less competent leader than Lincoln. And he wasn't as good at giving speeches as Lincoln either, so he was less interesting to the greater population. What he was interested in was centralization of the government in the South, and this led to criticism because many of the people in the Confederate States were more interested in small government, either within local settings or within the states, rather than a a national umbrella like they had in the United States. The South also hoped that Britain would supply the South, or support the South rather, because of the cotton supply. So the South farmed and processed the cotton that was sent to Britain, and they thought that Britain would side with them because it was a huge moneymaker for them. Britain actually decided not to intervene at all and sought different sources for cotton. They wanted to mostly stay out of things. And it's often referred to as a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. So the draft allowed people to pay someone to fight their own service rather than fight it themselves. And that meant that rich men could buy their way out while poor men were forced to fight. And it was fighting for the continuation of slavery, which was a rich man's concern as well. Poor men didn't have enough money to have an enslaved person, let alone probably a large enough farm to require one. And food riots actually spread throughout the South, and that was because there wasn't enough food to go around. And eventually, once fields were destroyed through battle, you had a severe lack of food, and with the men not home to oversee the farming as they had been, many of the crops failed if women at home hadn't been taught how to continue and how to oversee the enslaved people. Many of these crops would have failed. desertion was actually more common in the South because most people didn't have anything directly to lose with the freedom of slaves. So they, many people were going to be less dedicated if they didn't have direct skin in the game, and if they saw this 1 in 5 chance, this 20% chance that they were going to be killed, they and more in the South than 25%. If they couldn't be convinced for a particularly compelling reason, it was more likely that they were going to be interested in stepping away if they got the chance, which makes sense. There were some Southern Unionists, so people living within the South in favor of the Union, but that could be punished by death. The Free State of Jones is particularly interesting. This is Jones County, Mississippi, and this was a group of white men from the South who joined with freedmen and enslaved people in order to fight the Confederacy. They established their own pro-union free state in Mississippi. So they sectioned off a little piece of Mississippi and said, we're not with you, we're not with the South, we're not with the Confederate States, we're with the Union, and we'll fight for them. Within this mini state, they allowed for intermarriage, meaning the marriage between black and white, and the leader of this revolt, the leader of this Free State of Jones, Newt Knight, was married to a black woman and they had children. And this instance was left out of the historical record for quite some time because it didn't really fit anyone's narrative. So it obviously didn't fit the Southern narrative because Mississippi is part of the Deep South, and knowing that people had been rebelling and supporting the Union within that was hard to reconcile. And so far as the North leaving it out, it didn't fit their idea of what was happening either. And part of this is because there was this freedom for intermarriage, which was still not legal within the northern states. And part of it is also because it didn't allow for the generalization of Mississippi as this bad state for them. There were about 50,000 white Southerners who fought along with the Union Army. So it wasn't just this Free State of Jones, and it wasn't just a few people. 50,000 is a lot of people. Elizabeth Van Lew is also famous because when her father died in 1863, she freed the enslaved people that he had previously owned in Richmond, Virginia. She continued to pass information about Confederate plans on to Union forces through a spy ring that was created with other Union supporters in Virginia. So people were willing to fight for what they thought was right, regardless of what state they lived in, regardless of their position in society. Many Southern women were left to manage farms and plantations, including enslaved people, while men were away at war and after the war if the men didn't return. Many Southern women were mobilized to support troops financially and work in arms factories and as clerks, much like the Northern women. And many of them chose to return to the domestic sphere following the war if they were in a financial position to do so. Many were not because the South was left financially devastated. But if they were able to, many of them wanted to return to that state of being. Non-slaveholding women couldn't afford to keep farms going many times, so they needed governmental assistance. And many times they didn't get it. And if they did get it, there were often times where soldiers from both sides would come looking for food and supplies because they were oftentimes starving while they were out traveling between battles. And many women had their farms and their bodies raided. So their farms were raided, and they were oftentimes raped by both sides of soldiers. There were few and far between African Americans who were fighting for the Confederacy as well. In 1865, the Confederates decided to allow for the arming of slaves to help fight the war and protect the Southern way of life. Previous wars had used slaves to fight, and this didn't necessarily mean that they would gain their freedom at the end of that. Many African Americans didn't know about the Emancipation Proclamation at this point, because unless it was communicated to them, they wouldn't have known, because it was still illegal to teach enslaved people to read and write. And they didn't necessarily know always that the Confederate States were trying to be different than the United States. It wasn't always well explained, and that was oftentimes on purpose so that they could convince enslaved people to fight alongside them. Free Black people and enslaved people were typically used for labor to help the troops rather than for combat positions. They were often cooks. They were required to dig trenches eventually. They were tasked with carrying items from place to place and finding food and supplies. We talked about how the war went back and forth between the North and the South, and it began to turn eventually, and Gettysburg and Vicksburg in 1863 were major turning points that led the war to go for the North. So Gettysburg is probably the most famous battle of the Civil War, and there were about 165,000 soldiers involved. It was the largest battle on North American soil. And there were trenches that were dug on the northern side, and the roles were kind of switched, because before the South had been defending their land, and now it was the North defending their own land. So they had the better lay of the land. They had more impetus to fight. And the South retreated, actually, and never went north again after Gettysburg. So they weren't able to push back up into the North following this battle. In Vicksburg, the South surrendered at the same time as the Gettysburg victory, basically. And these joint victories helped to diminish Southern morale. So this idea that the South may be able to fight against the North and may actually be able to win was sort of doused at this point. And in Virginia in 1864, there were 6 weeks of sustained fighting with 60,000 Union dead and 30,000 Confederate dead. So over 6 weeks, you had nearly 100,000 people dead. So it's an extremely deadly war. And General William T. Sherman marched from Atlanta to the sea, pillaging and burning cities along the way in order to instill fear in the Southerners. So this is the Union Army trying to create this fear and this despair in order to get people to give up, essentially. As we know, the North eventually won the Civil War, and the country was technically mended back together at this point. Lincoln is quoted as saying, "With malice toward none, with charity for all, let us bind up the nation's wounds." So he's hoping everyone can bury the hatchet and move forward, and it's obviously an optimistic statement, and the reality of it is much different. On January 31st, 1865, the 13th Amendment was passed, which abolished slavery in the entire Union. And we have it down here, the Amendment 13. Section 1 says, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction." So it's saying that if you go to jail, for instance, it's not illegal to use your labor because you're serving on a punishment. But that otherwise, you can no longer enslave people. In Section 2, it says Congress shall have the power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So Congress is in charge of making sure that the laws comply. In April 1865, Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederate States, was occupied by Northern forces. April 9th, 1865, at the Appomattox Courthouse in Virginia, the official surrender of the Confederate Army took place. You can still visit the Appomattox Courthouse if you'd like to. It's a particularly symbolic place for us as a nation at this point. April 14th, 1865, just a few days after the Appomattox Courthouse surrender, Lincoln was killed in the D.C. Ford's Theater by John Wilkes Booth. A massive manhunt ensued for John Wilkes Booth, the killer, and 12 days later, he was killed when he was found. Lincoln's body was taken to Illinois for burial and had essentially a mourning tour along the way where thousands of people came to see his body go by and waved at the train as it was going by. Lincoln remains this martyr figure that can be included within the American civil religion. I know we've talked about this before, but it's sort of this secular understanding with a biblical framework of the United States, and Lincoln being one of the martyrs. One of the questions following the war was, what do you do after the war? Where does everyone go? How do you rebuild each society? How do you mend together these two groups who are fighting against each other so intently? The Sea Island experiment took place on islands off the coast of South Carolina, where about 10,000 enslaved people were left behind when their owners went to fight in the war. Reformers, we've talked about reformers before, attempting to create utopia, they flocked to the island to help them set up infrastructure and provide education. So they wanted them to be able to remain there and to be successful eventually. Forced labor, which was paid on plantations, they were being paid at this point, but they were still being told what to do, and oftentimes weren't paid enough in order to establish their own freedom in the way that they thought they might. And Lincoln was relatively lenient on Southern whites during the war because he wanted them to come to his side and reunite the country. So he hadn't been particularly harsh on them during the war. But following the war, things became much more solidified. There was no real focus on establishment of race relations and societal overhaul after the war. The main focus was on reuniting the white populations of the North and South. So again, that's the David Blight book that I talked about, the Race and Reunion, where African Americans essentially get the shaft and just get thrown under the bus in order to reunite these large pieces of white population in the country. So what does all of this mean? What does it mean to us as a nation? The Union's permanence ended up being somewhat solidified. 36 states existed at the time. Notably, the last state to be added to our current United States was in 1959. and that's Hawaii, and Alaska had been taken on only months before. So it really hasn't been that long that it's been the 50 states, and certainly it's been probably most of your lifetimes. But for instance, my mother was born in 1959, and her her parents were adults, functioning adults, my grandparents, um, when there were not quite 50 states yet. So if you can kind of put it into perspective, this isn't, while we know it hasn't always been 50 states because that's what we've been talking about all semester, it's interesting to put it in perspective to your own life. One major obvious point that came out of the Civil War is that slavery became outlawed and it was added to the constitutional amendments. Um, Things that happened more in the background were that this shifted power to the northern capitalists and away from the southern agriculturalists. So without slavery underpinning their entire operation, the South began to struggle more and more. African American freedom was up for debate at this point. So, did this mean a double victory finally? This concept of the double victory comes up over and over again. We've talked about it before, but it's this hope that the full rights of citizenship would be afforded to African Americans who helped win the war. And the next lecture will be on Reconstruction, so that's following the war and how people were attempting to mend the nation back together. For this lecture, that you have Voices of Freedom readings, so you'll also read in conjunction with this, and you have more than you normally do, but that means you have more to choose from. So you have the Voices of Freedom chapters 88, which is a letter of a Civil War soldier, so you can hear their own words. 89, in which Samuel Cox condemns emancipation, so this is going against emancipation. 90, Abraham Lincoln's The Gettysburg Address, which we talked about is quite short. You have 92, which is a letter by a mother of a black soldier. So again, like a more personalized approach. And number 94, Mary Livermore on Women and the War. So a bunch of different perspectives that you can get from this. And you'll write your response on one of those.